ضيفنا اليوم أحد الأسماء التي عاشت داخل مطبخ القرار الأميركي لعقود. رجل شارك في ملفات السلام العربي الإسرائيلي، وعمل مستشارا للرؤساء الأميركيين، وتولى أدوارا مباشرة في ملفات الخليج وإيران، وكان شاهدا على كثير من التحولات التي أعادت رسم المنطقة. السفير الأميركي والدبلوماسي المخضرم دينيس روس. أرحب بضيفي من واشنطن المبعوث الأمريكي السابق للسلام في الشرق الأوسط السيد دينيس روس. مرحبا بك وشكرا على قبول الاستضافة في هذا الوقت وفي هذه الظروف المهمة التي تمر بها المنطقة سيد دينيس. في البداية سؤالنا الأول حقيقة ربما الذي يدور في هذا الوقت، كيف تنظرون إلى ما يحدث الآن في المنطقة؟ هل نحن أمام العد التنازلي لعملية عسكرية أمريكية ضد إيران، أم أننا أمام أكبر عملية تفاوض تقيمها وتعمل عليها إدارة ترامب؟
Well, I think right now it's hard to know for sure. President Trump seems to believe that diplomacy works best when there is a real threat. And so as we've seen before, he's making it very clear that if there isn't an agreement soon, he is prepared to go ahead and use force again for at least some period of time. I do think there is an impulse right now to see if it's possible to reach an agreement. That agreement, I think, is still kind of conditioned on the issue of what Iran is prepared to do on its nuclear program, and also ensuring that there is a complete freedom of movement through the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, that seems to be the two areas where there's a division or gap between the U.S. and Iran. And the administration, I think, the president may have some patience, but I also suspect that he's not going to let this go on much longer.
ولكن هناك من يقول أن إيران تشتري الوقت وأنها ليست جادة في مسألة المفاوضات. إلى أي مدى تعتقد أن هذا الكلام صحيح سيد؟
Well, I think it's a fair question because the Iranians always approach negotiations as if time is their ally. Time is something they use. They count on the other side always becoming impatient. They feel they can always outlast whoever they're negotiating with. So I do think they're buying time. They're using the time to try to reconstitute as much as they can. I think they have been set back pretty dramatically in terms of their defense industrial base. They're clearly hurting economically, but imposing a terrible price on their own public is part of what the Iranian regime always does. So buying time for them is part of their natural approach to negotiations. They're counting on President Trump losing patience, and rather than going ahead and resuming the fighting or ending the ceasefire, that he'll concede on issues that they want him to concede on. So this is part of their natural strategy. The question is whether or not the president is going to stick to the positions he has, whether or not he's going to resume the use of force. And also the question is how much can this Iranian regime continue to hold out? They're certainly conveying the imagery that they can hold out, and they think time is on their side, and they think the president will basically decide to look for a way out. Right now, the short answer is nobody knows for sure what's going to happen.
بحكم خبرتك سيد دينيس وأنت تعاملت مع الإيرانيين لسنوات طويلة، تعتقد إلى أي مدى يستطيع هذا النظام أن يصمد وأن يتحمل هذه الضغوط الاقتصادية وكذلك الضغوط السياسية؟ هل يستطيع أن يصمد لوقت طويل، لأسابيع، لأشهر مثلا؟
I think they certainly want to convey the message that they can. The question, I think, in my mind, and this is, I think, the critical question, how long before they run out of space to store the oil? They will suffer damage to their wells, to their fields, if they have to shut down operation. Now, they have experience before with being able to export only small amounts of oil. That certainly happened in 2018 when President Trump did his maximum pressure campaign economically. they seem to be able to cope with that fairly well. The administration seemed to think that it had very little time, that it would be in a position where it could withstand the consequences of the blockade, would be in a position where it would have to shut in its oil wells. I think the Iranians probably have more of an ability to, as we would say, jerry-rig the system, come up with ways to preserve their wells, find storage space, put it on empty tankers and the like. I suspect they have a few months. The question is, does President Trump have that kind of a patience? Certainly patience has not been something that he's been known for. Does he think that the reapplication, intensive bombing again, is going to make much of a difference? And does he think that's the key to getting the Iranians to concede more? The interesting thing is, right now, I think his threats to use force are putting more pressure on the mediators than it necessarily is putting on the Iranians. The mediators seem desperate to try to come up with something that will ensure that the conflict doesn't resume. The question is, do the Iranians feel that pressure? They're certainly doing everything they can to signal they are not feeling that pressure.
صحيح، لكن هنا السؤال كذلك سيد دينوس، يعني هل بقاء النظام الإيراني هو الأفضل للشعب الإيراني، للمنطقة، للولايات المتحدة، أم تغيير النظام؟ يعني اليوم نحن نرى المشهد وكأن النظام قادر على أن يتماسك وأن يصمد، فهل هناك احتمال أن تتعامل الولايات المتحدة مع نفس النظام ولكن في وضع آخر مثلا؟
Well, I think the answer to those questions, may vary. I would simply say, in answer to your question, is the regime good for the Iranian people? The answer is absolutely not. It's a disaster for the Iranian people. The Iranian regime is prepared to continue to suppress its public. It imposes a terrible price on them, but regime survival is what matters, not the well-being of the public. Now, is the Trump administration prepared to deal with this regime? I think the answer is yes. I think it's prepared to deal with this regime, but it has requirements. And the requirements are that there's enough done to ensure that Iran really can't have a nuclear weapon even over time. That relates to the issue of no enrichment. It relates to the issue of shipping out the highly enriched near weapons grade uranium. It relates also to reopening the straits. Now, clearly, there's a kind of trade-off between the U.S. lifting the blockade and the Iranians allowing ships to go through, but the Iranians have discovered they have a strategic card. Will they be prepared to give it up? In the end, the one interesting thing to me is President Trump cannot allow this to end with Iran controlling the straits or charging a toll. Maybe there is a new international regime, but he can't accept a situation where somehow Iran determines whose ships can pass through the strait. He cannot accept that. He may be able to accept certain compromises on the nuclear issue. He cannot accept an outcome where the Iranians are determining who transits the straits and who doesn't. In a lot of ways, that's the more immediate issue. The president's already signaled he's willing to accept a suspension of enrichment. Now, he would like it to be for an extended period of time. That's probably something they could reach an agreement on. The issue of shipping out the near weapons grade material, that seems to be something that, again, is a division, is something that divides the two sides. But I suspect even there's probably some kind of compromise on downblending or diluting the 60%, having some percentage of it shipped out. You can find, I suspect, compromises on that. The one thing that there's no ability to compromise on is Iran still determining who goes through the straits and whether or not they have to pay a fee to go through the straits.
فيما يتعلق في هذه الجزئية بالتحديد اليورانيوم، إلى أو نسأل ما هو الحد الأدنى لقبول إدارة ترامب في مسألة الملف النووي في الإيراني؟ يبدو أن هناك تمسك إيراني كبير في هذا الملف، لكن ما هو الحد الأدنى أو حتى الحد الأقصى الذي يمكن أن يقبل فيه ترامب في هذا الملف؟
Well, again, I think it comes down to how can he say publicly that he has changed this to the point where they really won't have a weapon. Let's bear in mind what the reality is. Last June, for 12 days, Israel attacked Iran's sites, its nuclear sites, and then the U.S. came in, the Trump administration came in for one day and hit the sites that Israel really didn't have the means, specifically Fordo. We used a massive ordnance penetrator, 12 of them, and between Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, which are not the only nuclear infrastructure sites, but the most important ones, those have been damaged severely. Not obliterated, but damaged severely. It would take a lot of time to rebuild them. It would take a lot of money to rebuild them. It'll take, then, in addition to that, you have to extract what's buried deep underground. I think if there was a commitment on the Iranian side that they would not rebuild some of these sites, there would be no enrichment for, say, 12 years, and there would be some ship out, maybe not all of the highly enriched uranium, but the 60% would be down blended so that it would be, below, it would not be highly enriched anymore. And some of it would be shipped out, so it would be outside of Iran. I think that would probably be something the president could accept. But I do think there's one issue here, which is, are they going to rebuild these sites? Do you rebuild Fordo, which is a site built into a mountain? If they're going to rebuild that, that suggests that this is not about, civil use of nuclear power. This is about preserving the option to have a nuclear weapon. And I think the president wants to be able to say they have given that option up. I think, as I said, I think there might be ways to bridge the divides, but he has to be able to credibly say they have given up the option.
في مقال تحدثت عن غورباتشوف إيراني، أن يظهر نفس غورباتشوف في إيران، وذلك ربما حتى في آرائك سيد روس أنك ترى أن إسقاط النظام الإيراني غير ممكن. فمن هو غورباتشوف الإيراني من وجهة نظرك؟
Well, one of the things that Ali Khamenei, the former supreme leader, was deeply concerned about was the emergence of an Iranian Gorbachev, someone who would come in to try to save the Islamic Republic by changing fundamentally the way it identifies what its purposes are, and that would mean creating a different set of priorities where you put the internal development and reconstruction in the public first, where you end isolation and confrontation with the rest of the world, where you change your priorities. My own view is when the war ends, then this Iranian regime will become even more vulnerable. And it will become even more vulnerable because it can't cope with any of its internal contradictions. This is a regime, even before the war, that was unable to provide water. You're looking last summer at the need where the president of Iran was talking about having to evacuate large numbers of people out of Tehran because of the water shortages. This is a problem that is becoming only more acute because of mismanagement, corruption, terrible approach to water use issues related to agriculture. It has an inability to provide water to meet the needs of a public. Nothing is more basic than that. It is a country that produces oil and natural gas, and yet it has electricity shortages, which requires shutting down businesses, the government, and schools. It is a regime that can't provide a currency that has any value. These are structural problems. They're not going to go away. The Revolutionary Guard controls about probably nearly half of the economy. It distorts the economy. It's all the alienation of the Iranian public is a function of the inability of the regime to deliver fundamental governance on the one hand and being totally corrupt on the other. So the reality is, at some point when this war is over, How does Iran deal with all of these basic contradictions? And my sense is over time, what we will see is that some within the elite will say the only way we can save this system is to truly carry out reform, is to truly restructure who we are. That's what an Iranian Gorbachev would mean. That's what Ali Khamenei feared. My own view is when the war ends, it's not going to happen immediately, but the need to make choices will be very significant. I am concerned that if there is a deal and it provides an economic lifeline to the regime, it doesn't mean it's going to save the regime, but it certainly buys it time, and it also gives it some means to try to make choices. Even then, the idea of trying to rebuild their military capability on the one hand and trying to address domestic needs on the other, even with an economic lifeline, that's going to be difficult. So I don't expect the emergence of an Iranian Gorbachev immediately, but if you ask me 12 to 18 months after this war, the prospect of an internal change along those lines, I think, goes up. And one last point on this. If you go back and you look at the last June of the 12-day war, one of the things you saw in the aftermath of it, there were voices in the Iranian elite who, for the first couple weeks after that 12-day war, were making it clear that the whole Khamenei strategy of the regional proxy network, which cost enormous amounts of money on the one hand, and was basically lost on the other, $40 billion to try to shore up Bashar al-Assad, and he's gone. Hezbollah dramatically weakened, Hamas dramatically weakened, all the money put into the proxies. And what did it produce? Great cost to Iran, but no real, in the end, it didn't produce what Iran expected it to produce, at least what Khamenei expected it to produce. Not to mention, I would say $500 billion in investment over the last 30 years in their nuclear infrastructure. And most of that has been severely damaged. So there were those who were raising this as a failure of the strategy after the 12-day war last June. And those people haven't disappeared. They're obviously not significant right now in terms of the balance of power, but they're still there. And the basic contradictions within the system will have to be addressed when the war is over. The irony is, the longer the war goes on, it creates an excuse for the Revolutionary Guard-dominated leadership not to have to make any choices, at least as it relates to what it does for the civilian public. When the war is over, it's going to have to confront some of those.
نعم، إذن هل نستطيع أن نشبه هذه الحرب بحرب الثمانينات ونهاية الحرب في 88، وكما ذكرت ربما إحدى المرات أن النظام الإيراني قد يتجرع كأس السم مرة أخرى؟ هل ترى هذا الشيء ممكن باختصار سيد روس؟
Look, I think, again, in the aftermath of the war, Iran is going to have to begin to confront what are really its severe challenges. Look, it's not just that its defense industrial base has been probably 90% destroyed. It is also that the petrochemical and steel industries, some of its major facilities have been destroyed. Its economic situation is quite disastrous. Something has to be done. And the irony, as I said, is so long as the war is underway, you don't have to deal with any of that. When the war ends, then you're confronted with the realities, and the realities are going to be pretty terrible. A defense industrial base that has largely been destroyed, an economy that is near collapse, huge unemployment. I mean, these are challenges you can't wish away. The war, it allows, especially given who dominates the decision-making right now, to avoid dealing with them. It'll be interesting to see what do they do when the war ends. I suspect that they will be even more focused on the need to coerce the public because they fear the public's demands and new demonstrations, so they'll try to do more of a crackdown, but even that isn't sustainable over time. They have shut down the internet for the entire point of the war, the entire time of the war. That also disrupts and undermines their economy further. So they can't avoid all those choices forever. The war provides a built-in pretext not to deal with them. When the war's over, they're not going to have a choice. They're going to have to deal with them.
نعم، لننتقل سيد روس إلى الخليج. رأيت في هذه الحرب كيف أن الخليج أصبح جزء أساسي من هذه الحرب، رغم أنه كان يعني يتمسك بموقف واضح منذ البداية. الولايات المتحدة الآن كيف تنظر للخليج؟ هل تنظر إليه كشريك أمني أم تنظر إليه مجرد شريك اقتصادي فقط؟ وكيف تنظر إلى مستقبل العلاقة بين الولايات المتحدة ودول الخليج بشكل عام؟
It's a good question, because I think on the one hand, the Gulf states didn't want this war, but are paying the price of the war. Many of the Gulf states thought that they could have a policy of containment towards Iran on the one hand, but also reach out to Iran. They didn't see themselves acting against Iran, and yet Iran chose to attack all of them. So on the one hand, there's probably a continuing need for a security relationship with the United States. On the other hand, there's probably a desire to be in a position where it has some greater influence over what the U.S. chooses to do, especially when the U.S. takes decisions that affect them. I think there'll probably be some hedging of some bets. There'll be some will look to China, but in a limited way. China has a relationship with Iran, but there's no indication it's used any of that leverage on them. And some of the support that China provided the Iranians contributed to their ability to attack the Gulf states. So yes, there'll be a continuing commercial relationship with China, maybe even some limited ties in the non-commercial areas, maybe security areas. But the U.S. will still be the major security partner. It's interesting, other countries like Ukraine will be, I think, of even greater interest because of their capacity to deal with the drone threat. That's an interesting sign which actually shores up Ukraine's capabilities against the Russians. I don't see the Gulf states deciding to separate themselves from the U.S. On the other hand, I think that they will feel they are owed more and entitled to know more about what the U.S. is going to decide to do, because U.S. decisions affect them, have a consequence for them, and they should feel that they have some input into the decisions that are made.
اليوم كيف ترى وأنت الخبير في هذا الملف؟ هل ترى إسرائيل اليوم بعد كل هذه الحروب أكثر أمناً في المنطقة؟
Well, it certainly faces less of a threat from the Iranians than it did. There is probably several years that has been bought. I think in the meantime, we're going to have an election in Israel. This is an Israeli government that in every polls is not very popular. So I suspect there's a potential for change in Israel after the upcoming election. The election will either be in September or has to be held by the end of October. And I suspect we may see a change within Israel. I think Israel, on the one hand, probably has bought some time from the standpoint of security. On the other hand, I think there's a question of its relationship with the Palestinians, and it needs to look again at what that future relationship is going to be. This particular Israeli government is clearly building towards a one-state outcome, which I think ultimately, whether it's by design or consequence, doesn't serve Israel's interests. And the question is, given the kind of what I would describe as the psychic overhang of October 7th, most Israelis look at Palestinians and fear any Palestinian state would be led by Hamas. There has to be a demonstration that won't be the likelihood if you're going to see any real change between the Israelis and Palestinians from the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, until there's real reform, not a phony reform, but until there's real reform, there won't be the basis for building a state. And the one thing that I think that is critical is Arab states can lead the effort to produce real reform on the Palestinian side. If you look at point 19 of what President Trump's 20 points were, it said that if the Palestinian Authority faithfully carries out reform, that can create the path to self-determination and a state for Palestinians. What we're seeing right now is no real sign of reform. If you had real reform on the Palestinian side, then it can start with what happens in Gaza. Gaza is a key here because you can have reconstruction in Gaza, but you can't have it without demilitarization. Hamas is still holding out. Hamas wants to hold its weapons. The one thing Hamas guarantees is there's no future for the Palestinians except more suffering. So there are things that can be done between Israelis and Palestinians. I do think in the coming year, when the war is over, after the Israeli election, there will be a potential to change things, but it starts with a transformation in Gaza. If, in fact, Hamas is no longer controlling Gaza, that also sends a message to Israelis that Hamas would not be the leader of a Palestinian state. So there needs to be change on all sides when it comes to this issue. And it'll also be interesting to see is how committed is President Trump to trying to pursue, when this war is over, the implementation of his 20 points.
جميل. سؤالنا الأخير سيد روس، كيف تقيم طريقة تعامل الولايات المتحدة مع إيران من منطلق المشهد الذي نعيشه اليوم في المنطقة ومن خلال 47 عام الماضية؟ هل أخطأت الولايات المتحدة في تعاملها مع النظام الإيراني؟ وباختصار لو سمحت، لأن الوقت داهمنا تقريبا.
Well, I think the answer is we've made many mistakes over the years in terms of how we deal with Iran. One fundamental mistake was prior to President Trump, to be fair to President Trump, previous presidents created an impression for the Iranians that they had a kind of impunity. They could cross all sorts of lines, whether it was enriching to 60% or building a proxy network that threatened all the other states in the region. And they got away with it. They got away with it for far too long. The problem, I think, at this point, however, is that you got to have a strategy. It's not at all clear what President Trump's strategy is. Had President Trump worked out an arrangement with the Israelis where for 7 to 10 days they did intensive attacks just against the military and defense industrial infrastructure in Iran, but not gone after the regime. They could have held in reserve the threats against the regime so the regime would not try to close down or control the Straits of Hormuz. Since 1987-88, Iran made no effort to try to control the Straits. And the reason was they were convinced it would produce a war that could threaten the regime. Now, the fact is the president should have held in reserve the threats to the regime while weakening the Iranian capacity to threaten its neighbors. I wish that had been the approach. I hope the outcome of this war is not one that gives the Iranians some potential to have an economic lifeline. I hope the outcome of this war is that there will be a containment deterrent strategy so the inner contradictions within Iran can come to the fore. From that standpoint, as I said, this Iranian leadership is going to be in more difficulty when the war is over than in the current situation.
من واشنطن المبعوث الأمريكي السابق للسلام في الشرق الأوسط دينيس روس، شكرا جزيلا لك والشكر لكم مشاهدينا. نلتقي في حلقة جديدة الأسبوع المقبل من برنامج بالمنطق.